From that introduction, I suspect you'd rather have my daughter up here than me, which is fine. It makes sense. I'd rather have my daughter up here than me. She's doing really interesting stuff at the intersection of post-colonial theory and museum studies, doing a dissertation on the role of museums in South Africa. So, I'm the boring part of the family compared. That's really true. Actually, some of you know my wife. Some of you work with my wife. My wife coordinates new church developments in Greater Atlanta. And so is overseeing 36 different new worshiping communities that are on their way to becoming Presbyterian churches. And you really ought to get her to come and talk with you at some point, because she's got a lot of interesting stuff. Our daughter Logan would be a little bit harder to get because she spends most of her time in Scotland. So, but Lindsay and I are around. Anyway, welcome. Good to have you all here today and to be with you. Trinity tends to call me about once a year to come in and do a couple weeks, but it's never on the same thing. I think this is the first time I've kind of had an overlap from the last time I talked, which was on food justice, to actually think about environment and theologies of creation care. So that's a little start of introductions. This is one of the rare places I would put my title up and people will go, I know that person. J. Erskine Love, Gay Love, the Love family has been prominent here at Trinity Presbyterian Church for quite a while. And we are honored and I'm honored to have a chair named after him. I wanted to make a few more introductions, though not more about me. Nick did that just fine. But I'm not the first speaker you've had. You took a little bit of a hiatus last week to do things like celebrate the resurrection. But you've had a couple of speakers in a couple weeks prior to that. And I'd love to hear, for those that were in those sessions, what did you hear and what did you take away from those? That'll help me kind of gauge where y'all are at a little bit. So what did you hear in those two sessions that you've already had, and what did you kind of walk away pondering or take away energized by? Or afraid of, as the case may be. Yeah, John?
I'll start with afraid was a more chaotic climate.
Yeah, good. That 1.5 degrees Celsius rise seems baked in now, but 3 is not, and 3 is catastrophic in a way that a lot of 1.5 would not be. That's part of the scary and hopeful bit in the middle of that. Good. What about others? What else did y'all hear? Yeah, Mac.
See a lot of hope in there.
Good. Glad to hear that. I don't know which book she was talking about. One, certainly, that is hopeful and practical is a book called Project Drawdown. By Catherine Wilkinson, who's actually Atlanta-based, although it's a national program thinking about ways to promote sustainability and reduce impact going forward. Anybody else? Reflections, thoughts? Yeah.
I heard the last speaker remind us of our call as Christians to be stewards, to be stewards of God's creation.
Excellent. You're launching right into where I need to go here today. So with that, let me note, just by way of kind of an opening conversation or a continuing conversation with us, that earlier this month, as a national holiday, we celebrated, maybe you weren't aware of it because nobody got time off of school or work for it, National All Is Ours Day, which happens on April 8th. Did y'all know that this is a holiday? What do you think about this being a holiday?
What does it mean?
It's a fair question. Let's see if we can suss out what it might mean. What do you think it would mean based on its title? That we're the top of the heap. It certainly seems to imply that we are apex, as it were. What else do you see? It's the website to talk about it, www.nationaldayscalendar.com. That's where yeah.
On a positive side, you could say there's a responsibility inherent in that statement.
Yeah, that there may be a responsibility here. If it is ours, we have a certain level of responsibility toward it. And I think that was part of the initial impetus for the creation of the day in the first place. National not being all by definition, all being all by definition. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Seems like maybe a contrast between, if I understand right, the Native American mindset that nothing is ours, the earth is on loan from our grandchildren, and more like, no, it's ours.
Yeah, so there is this contrast between arguments about ownership and non-ownership, not only at economic levels, but even at conceptual levels. Good. Yeah.
Was it intentionally
Vague?
Vague, no, vague.
Vague? VAGU? I don't know the answer to that question. I did some research on it. I didn't do enough research to find out whether or not they had intentionally created it to be a vague term. Yeah, good. Well, and that is absolutely fair. So are a lot of things not very.
Who created it?
It was created.
I mean, was there a committee?
It's good Presbyterian.
So yes, there was a kind of ad hoc committee that had an interest in creating it that worked the political systems in order to bring it about. I'm blanking right now on when it happened and kind of the details. I may pull those up halfway through and then stop and we'll back up a long ways. Probably not, but anyway. So I do want to kind of just signal that there is a kind of a theological peculiarity in National All Is Ours Day. It's not only peculiar vis-a-vis Native Americans, but it's peculiar in the context of Christian thought about how we think about all. After all, Psalm 24 begins, "The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it." That would be more National All Is God's Day than All Is Ours Day. I ask this question partly to start to get at teasing out different ways that people have thought about and engaged creation and creation care from theological perspectives. And toward that end, I want to start by noting something that a colleague of mine who teaches up at Drew, Laurel Kearns, argued, and that then shows up in a book that another colleague, Willis Jenkins, wrote on ecologies of grace, that there have been within the broader Christian mindset three broad theological approaches to engaging creation care. And they've distinguished them something like this. And here I'm blending what Laurel said and what Willis writes. The first is an eco-justice framework in which we focus on justice as a part of our obligations toward God, in which God is participating. Right, part of sanctification. This is a sanctification movement through which we discern something of the way God works out there in the integrity of creation. Integrity being a big word in Roman Catholic thought especially, and this is kind of a Roman Catholic kind of vision of things. And then it's our job to, having discerned, work in alignment with what that integrity looks like, to promote that integrity. If any of you have read Pope Francis's Laudato Si, Pope Francis just departed and a profound voice in Christian thought and certainly in environmental concern, you'll see this kind of sense of the integrity of creation is what we need to be attentive to. And as we're attentive to the integrity of creation, we see God's handiwork and God at work in creation. And then it's our basic job to align our thought and our work with that. So there's an eco-justice side of things because part of that integrity means that we will consistently work to promote just ways of going forward, which looks something like living in harmony. A second way that Laurel Kearns and Willis Jenkins have talked about theological approaches to creation care is the focus on stewardship, which is a more Protestant way in which we encounter God. In our encounter with God, we hear something that God is commanding and enabling us to do about caring for God's creation. Right? So stewardship isn't so much a response to what we see in creation as a response to what we hear from God, if that distinction makes sense. And this is a pretty Protestant way of doing things. That whole, you have heard a word from God and now are commanded and able to go out and do, ought to sound pretty familiar to anybody who's ever actually attended a worship service at Trinity Presbyterian Church. That's the way we build our worship services, right? You kind of prepare your hearts for worship. You prepare yourself to hear the word of God, then the word of God is proclaimed, and then the charge out of that word is what you go forward from. So there is a kind of a stewardship focus, which has something to do with the way God acts redemptively in our lives, and in our lives then toward the curing of the ills of creation. And in a third way that Laurel Kearns and Willis Jenkins have talked about theological approaches to creation care is a kind of ecological spirituality. And here they name more Eastern Orthodox focuses in which encounters in creation bring union with God. Certainly within Eastern Orthodox thought, there is this deep sense that our purpose that is actualized at some level is kind of our unity with God. And therefore, as we discern God in creation, we work as a part of creation to be united with God in that creation. So ecological spirituality will sound a little bit like we mentioned Native American, right? There's a kind of spirituality of oneness with creation before God, in which God is actually a part of that created order, and so oneness with God. So these are kind of three big trends, all of which have to do with why we ought to care about creation. But they kind of tend to manifest differently depending on what religious tradition we're in and what particular biases we have. For us, because we're good Protestants, our primary language has been stewardship. In fact, we've already had that language thrown around a little bit here. This is the most familiar language to us. And because of that, because of its familiarity and because of its impact, because of the degree to which it sits center in a way that a lot of Reformed theological thought engages creation and creation care, I want to spend some time today thinking about what stewardship is for us, how we make sense of it. And I want to note then kind of that because it's a priority and because we've heard it regularly, and not just in the fall season when they're trying to raise money, during stewardship season, which is, of course, a liturgical season that takes place somewhere in the fall before we hit Advent. Usually. I don't know when. When does Trinity do stewardship season? There's always a season for it. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Because we're familiar with it, we carry a lot of preconceptions about it. So I want to spend a couple minutes, and what I'm going to invite you to do is just gather in groups of 3, 4, 5, no more than 5, otherwise it just gets too big, just for a couple minutes to throw out kind of as a word association, when we hear the word stewardship, this is what we think means. This is what we think about. So we're just going to do that for a couple minutes, and then we'll hear back from you all and we'll move forward from there. So 3 or 4 minutes of what is stewardship for us? So, out of curiosity, so we're just going to want to raise it up, and I think we're on the web. So when you say something, it's likely I'm going to repeat it because it's less likely that people online are going to hear. Let's just start over kind of in the Carlton corner, as it were, over here. Where did you all find energy in the conversation?
Oh, one of the things that we discussed was that stewardship is an active process of caring for the things that are around you so that they're left better than what they were found.
Excellent. An active process of caring so that the things that are around you are left better than they were when you started. Right. Sounds like you were a Boy Scout at one time. How about back toward these groups that were back here?
We talked more about stewardship being not ownership, and that would, even that National Almost Hours Day, it sounds, that implies a little bit more ownership, and stewardship is not ownership, it's the opposite.
Stewardship is not ownership. And we have some good New Testament attestation in that regard, right? That we have all these stories about stewards who were clearly not the owners of things. They just had responsibilities toward them. Good. Let's work our way kind of this side. Things to add. Someone whose job professionally is actually to pay attention to these things.
Yes, stewardship. We talked about it being an ongoing thing, that it is not a one-time action, but that it is something that is continuing and renewing and ongoing.
Awesome. So stewardship is an ongoing thing. There are times where I think it'd be nice to be like do it once and be done with it, but that's not the world we live in. Good. And
Another word that we used was intention. If you're stewarding, you're doing it with intention. Stewardship doesn't happen without you going about it with, can't think of a synonym for intention, but it takes your involvement, whether it's with financial resources or time or gifts. It doesn't just happen without you doing it.
right.
Does that make sense?
So there's an intentionality to it. Maybe one last comment. We'll let John jump in for a last word here.
Stewardship requires the steward to take risk.
Stewardship requires the steward to take risk. Interesting and important, and something that actually shows up again in the parables, right? The bad steward is the one who digs a hole and puts the money, puts the talents in the hole. That stewardship involves not only intentionality and ongoingness and activity, responsibility, but a kind of willingness to risk. Let's play those ideas out a little bit as we think about what stewardship as a centerpiece of creation care from Protestant, especially Reformed Presbyterian perspectives might look like. The first thing I want to note is that when we're talking about stewardship, it's not like we're off on our own, right? That certainly the Abrahamic faiths have all signaled the importance of stewardship in their traditions. So within Islam, the Prophet Muhammad notes, "The world is beautiful and verdant, and verily God, be he exalted, has made you his stewards in it, and he sees how you acquit yourselves." So within Islam, there's an emphasis on stewardship. We see it also in Christianity. Rather than pick a parable, I did pick a passage from Colossians, "For in Christ all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him," which signals they're not created in us and for us. And then finally from the Midrash, from Judaism, "Look at my works, how beautiful and praiseworthy they are. Everything that I have created, I created for you. Take care not to damage and destroy my world, for if you destroy it, there is no one to repair it after you." Got a little Carlton in there, didn't we? Yeah. So there are kind of subtleties of difference in the way that the Abrahamic faiths talk about stewardship, but it shows up prominently for all of them, and which turns out to be a meaningful thing when we're dealing with something like creation care, because maybe you haven't noticed, but environmental concerns don't feel especially bound to national boundaries, right? The environment goes where it is. What happens in one place impacts other places, not a respecter of borders. So when we have multiple faiths using language of stewardship, we actually gain capacity to engage creation care at much more greater and significant levels. Our kind of story of creation care via stewardship within Christianity primarily starts with Genesis 1, right? At the very beginning, when God creates humankind, Genesis 1 says, "Let them," that's us, "have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." And the Lord planted, and so at the beginning, let me back up here just so I don't throw you all off. At the beginning, there is this claim about control and a claim implicitly about how we relate to everything else. But part of that relation gets nuanced so it doesn't look something like you can just do whatever you want with the next chapter when God clarifies what our responsibility, our first job is to take care of the garden. The first profession is gardener. And in fact, tilling and keeping the garden is something that happens before a fall, right? Some of the things that we associated with work and labor feel like, okay, now we have to do this because everything isn't Edenic anymore, sweat of your brow type stuff. But there was a vocation built in from the beginning for human beings, not just about a dominion in order to do what we wanted, but about a care to do what God was calling us to do. It creates a certain tension for us in creation care that Protestants especially have to pay attention to, and I picked a passage out of Willis's book to get at this, where Willis notes that part of the irony or the paradox of stewardship as the centerpiece for doing creation care is that it means our primary, the primary reason we're doing it has less to do with the integrity of creation, has more to do with the quality of our relationship with God. Right? So Willis writes, the strategy of stewardship frames environmental issues around faithful response to God's invitation and command. It organizes concern for environmental problems around obligatory service to the Creator who entrusts to humans measured responsibilities for creation. The normative force, the real weight for stewardship, therefore, comes not by nature's dignity, but from the extrinsic command by which human acts are claimed. Creation certainly has its moral dignity, but for stewardship, that dignity is derivative. What do you think about what Willis has to say there when he talks about stewardship with regard to environmental concern? Does it ring true? Does it create concerns or problems for you? Does it create opportunities or possibilities? What is dignity derivative from? And the response would be something like, all things gain their dignity by virtue of the fact that God creates and calls them good. So the dignity comes ultimately from God, not from something intrinsic in us or intrinsic in creation. Questions or other comments or concerns? Well, let me, Sam.
So when we talked about stewardship, there was a lot about active engagement and intentionality and so forth. I don't know that we've mentioned, but as far as I can tell from the way steward and the office of steward was in common parlance in, say, New Testament times, there also is kind of an accountability. In other words, stewardship maybe implies not just care, but responsibility to someone or something else. And it seems like this kind of aligns perhaps with that part of it.
Yeah, it does. So that what stewardship reveals is that our primary responsibility actually ultimately is toward God. The means through which we activate or kind of actualize that responsibility may involve caring for creation, but creation becomes the means through which we signal our responsibility to God. And that's part of what Willis wants to get at here, is a tension within those of us who emphasize stewardship as a theological claim central to the way we do creation care. One other one here that Willis would want to highlight, or does highlight a little bit later in the book, and since you didn't have to read the book, I didn't give homework. You may be not thinking about it, which is there's an assumption in stewardship that the steward is somehow different in kind from the thing that they're stewarding. That stewardship underregards the fact that human beings are themselves creatures created on the same day as all the other animals. Well, all the other land animals, I should say. With Bo in the back here, I don't want to say too many things about the Old Testament to get me in trouble. Right? That it ignores the fact that human beings are themselves part of creation. That we ourselves are creatures. That stewardship has the potential to kind of separate us from the rest of creation, even if its purpose is to say we ought to be concerned about and care for creation. And that may be a misstep when you recognize that, I think the latest I heard was something like, 70% of our genetic makeup we share with bananas. 99% of our genetic makeup we share with chimps, right? We're not of different stuff than everything else that lives. Whether we think about that theologically, we are creatures created at the same time as land mammals, or whether we think about it biologically, we're composed of the same materials. Stewardship threatens to wrong foot us if what it does is also separate us. So as we're thinking about stewardship here, and I know Trinity's good at thinking about stewardship. I've been around y'all for every once in a while for a long time. We want to actually kind of pay attention to that. So part of what I want to do then is ask the question going forward, if this is a concern that ought to be real for us, what might we do about it? How might we think about stewardship in this environmental age in which we live? And toward that end, a couple of points. And you all have mostly said this, so I'm going to kind of go through them because y'all are really smart. The stewardship's coherence turns on placing it against an encompassing, and I would say here, religious vision. National All Is Ours Day doesn't feel like there's much religion built into it, but when you say stewardship and you make claims about a responsibility to another, that other is much more likely to look like God and become religious than not. So there's an underlying religious sensibility to stewardship that's worth our attention, that makes stewardship as an idea, let alone a set of practices, coherent. Stewardship's significance is premised on a prior conviction that materiality and material stuff is good. This is a great claim in the Old Testament and profoundly repeated and emphasized throughout scriptures and in the New Testament, that stuff is good, that stuff warrants care, even if the care is warranted because God says this is good, which God does, right? Every day, God saw that it was good. God says it's very good. We don't care if there's stuff we don't care about. We often don't think it's worth our attention. Then we're likely to do away with it or to abuse it. So stewardship significance is based on the idea that the stuff that we're dealing with actually ought to matter, and that it does matter already. Its meaning is clarified then when we shape our lives and language around an understanding of that backdrop and conviction. So how are we going to go forward as stewards? We're going to recognize that when we talk about being stewards, we're using religious language. And when we talk about how to be stewards, we're going to recognize that creation is good. And everything else follows from that. And then finally, I would suggest that stewardship is kind of the practice then of treating the stuff of the world as gift from a God who gives abundantly, rather than as, for instance, consumable products whose value can be measured by their scarcity. I'm shifting maybe from preaching to meddling here, because the measurement according to scarcity is a precondition for most forms of capitalism, right? How do we know what something is valued? Part of it is its scarcity. Where it's really abundant, it tends to get devalued. Abundance matters here. Okay.
I'm thinking of all the conservation movements that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think has anything to do with God. I mean, I guess I'm trying to separate them where you're trying to put them together.
You're good. Just hold it up to your face.
All right. That better?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just trying to sort out the difference between conservation, which really can be stewardship,
Mm-hmm.
but it has no religious affiliate to that concept.
Right.
So,
Right.
I mean, and the conservation movement has been extremely strong and done wonderful things. So,
Yeah.
I'm
So,
questioning.
yeah, so the question, just in case y'all didn't hear, was how do we think about the concept of conservation, which is language that gets used by a lot of organizations that do environmental concern. You mentioned Sierra Club, the Environmental Defense Fund, others. How does that align with stewardship? And part of my answer would be there are people that those who emphasize conservation can do so for very good reasons, and some of them will do so for reasons that sound like stewardship from a religious ear, but not all. There are other reasons to do conservation. You can do conservation just out of a simple sense of threat. I am conserving because if I don't, I'm worried what's going to happen to me and mine. That's different than out of a sense of abundance and a sense of stewardship. So all this gets then, or starts to get to then what the really meaty question is for those of us who tend to emphasize stewardship when we're thinking about creation care, which is how might our understanding of stewardship connect to the way we relate then to the non-human natural world? I hinted at it a little bit with notions about abundance and kind of God's work. And here, let me kind of throw some big ideas at you to play with. The first is that whatever else stewards do, they don't sit at the center of the narrative. That God sits at the center of the narrative. And God's actions sit at the center of the narrative. And so decentering humans can feel a little bit threatening to those of us that are liking to be at the center. It ought at this point to feel relieving, because what it suggests is at the end of the day, it will not ultimately be our responsibility to solve the world and make everything come out right. That's still a centering of humans. To decenter humans goes, ultimately what God is doing is bringing about the kingdom, bringing about the consummation of all creation. Our stewarding job may be to figure out how God is calling us to do certain tasks in the middle of that. But as long as we center ourselves, whether that's our particular concerns or our particular fears or our particular tasks, we fail to understand kind of how to be steward. Second is that we can't do stewardship at this point in human history without attention to the systems in which we live. We don't live unimpacted by non-human things. We just have gone through a pandemic in which we discovered that very small things that are not initially us can have a huge impact on us. Things that happen out there hit. So part of being a steward has to look something like, at this point, stewardship means care. It also means care for other things. It also means recognizing that those other things are going to hit. They're going to bump us. They're going to push back against us. So you can be a good steward or a bad steward, and being a good steward is going to look more like attention to the way the ecosystems are impacting us, even as we're thinking about how properly to engage and steward ecosystems. Yeah?
How does that feel? How do you reconcile that with the notion of sort of the delegation to humans, that God said, you have dominion?
Mm-hmm. So how do we reconcile this notion of kind of attention to ecosystem within this notion of dominion? So there's a couple kind of pieces to pull out here. The first piece to pull out is that ultimate dominion is God's. The second piece to pull out is that God puts us in creation, so we're not kind of up with the angels to be stewards. We're down amongst to be stewards. The third part is that we're creatures with other creatures in this activity. In fact, in a moment, I'm going to actually note that part of what good stewards do is let other things do their responsible stuff. They have their own, the creatures get their unique vocations. Ours happens to be stewarding. Bees, let me just jump forward. Bees have a vocation. We benefit from that vocation because they pollinate. And when they pollinate, that helps us produce plants for our own consumption. We need bees. We need pollinators. But they're doing it not because we need them to. They're doing it because that's their vocation. That's what God called them into. So part of stewarding for us is recognizing that other parts of creation have their own roles to play in creation care, including our own well-being. Does that mean then that we can just let them do their things? Well, kind of, but kind of not, because at this point, we do all kinds of things that disrupt bees, right? We have catastrophic hive collapses because of any number of forces, including pollutants, including climate change and other forces. So stewarding with bees now looks a little bit like what can we do to help the bees out, because we've been doing a fair amount of things that don't help the bees out. Does that help a little bit?
Once again, it's we're doing it.
Yeah, and this is the
So the secondary delegation.
right. That I'm only going to repeat myself at this point, so that doesn't seem a wise way forward. Hold that. I may come back and answer that question better. Here's where I was headed to next, right? That all creatures and ecosystems have distinct vocations. Ecosystems function and are healthy where everything is kind of doing its thing in concert with, in harmony with, relative harmony with other things. Which means that our stewardship looks something like how are we operating harmoniously or promoting the harmony of others doing their stuff. I don't want to become the means through which plants get pollinated in order to achieve my own food source. Bees are way better at it. And then finally, if you're aware of these things, then stewardship has to start to recognize that our flourishing is going to happen collectively, not human beings alone, apart from the rest of creation. I have a colleague who teaches at Aberdeen, who's written a couple of really lovely books on theologies of animals, and part of what he pushes on in those books is that all species have vocation that is unique to them, and that where creation care works, including for those who emphasize stewardship, it works because we're making sure that others can do their vocation. There may be an analogy here in recognizing that the effective CEO does not prevent employees from doing their job well. The effective CEO does his job or her job well when they're creating conditions through which employees can thrive. That's what a successful business looks like, right? Just kind of map that onto larger scales.
I'm just thinking of animals with vocations, like wolves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we let them all do their own vocation, it doesn't necessarily help those with, chickens and turkeys and whatever. How do you make that all play out? I mean,
right. Well, let's play with the wolf example here because it's been a contentious one in parts of the U.S. Where wolves have been reintroduced, right? And there was concern, especially among ranchers, that when wolves come in, they're likely to go after maybe not the chickens. Those tend to stay pretty close to home, and the wolves are less interested in them. The foxes and the coyotes maybe will go after the chickens, but the wolves will go after, for instance, lambs and calves. Fair. But part of the reason wolves have been reintroduced is that when you removed an apex predator like a wolf from a particular ecosystem, what you got was the explosive growth of deer. And those deer had their own significant negative impact on that ecosystem through their overpopulation. Not only eating our vegetables, which is annoying, but where you don't have apex predators like wolves, part of what you get is things like chronic wasting disease in deer, which then threatens to transfer over to human beings and create illness. Because there's not a system to kind of weed out the deer that shouldn't be around in the first place, right? So wolves may have this vocation that's going to sit in tension with ours, because we kind of want our chickens around or our lambs around. Some of us ate last week. Right? But the implications of not having wolves around could actually be in the long run far more detrimental to us along the way. Yeah, and I wanted to kind of close with some questions. We get another week together, so I didn't plan on kind of ending everything with a nice bow.
This just reminds me of, okay. I was up in North Georgia at a river. It was an event hosted by the Nature Conservancy. And somehow we got on the topic of trees and them falling over the river. And they used to work harder to clear the trees and get more involved that way. But they realized that the trees coming down creates a more meandering river, which then impacts the flooding. You know, you don't have the flooding. And it just, even though our impact does do things that probably mess that system up a little bit, but it's just it shows how the trees do their own thing by falling on the rivers, you know, to create the right kind of environment.
Yeah, which goes back to then maybe part of our stewarding and responsibilities to think about what flourishing for that entire ecosystem looks like, because we don't want the trees, and likely in this instance probably the invasive trees, to disrupt the ecosystem, because where that ecosystem is disrupted, you actually get larger harm. Now, some of those benefits and harms get really tricky, because what flooding feels like to us as a part of a kind of a natural cycle can feel very different from what flooding feels like to the fish species that rely on regular natural cycles of flooding for their own flourishing. I don't want to make it easy for us. I don't say that steward is easy. If anything, stewardship is a way harder thing to do because of the levels of attention you have to give to so many other things, which doesn't make it illegitimate or wrong. It just means that it's complicated, as all true and good things are. Other kind of questions, thoughts? I can hear the organ warming up. Got 5 more minutes here. Max got one.
I think the interesting aspect, those of us who live in Atlanta, we have a tree ordinance that supposedly governs removing trees and you have to replace them. But everybody knows if you ever fly into Atlanta, and if you've done it for a long time, the trees are disappearing. So you have a conflict of somebody who says, I own this tree, and if I want to make a tomato patch, I've got a right to cut down this tree. And so we need to work hard to emphasize that ownership is not the key on that. If in England, a guy that owns a tavern cut down a 200-year-old tree recently, he's gotten all kind of heat because he thought it was, but it was interesting that the public in England has tremendously risen up against this guy. And so the concept of stewardship and ownership, we need to focus on.
Yeah. Which is not to say, by the way, that stewards are preservationists. We're not trying to keep everything exactly the way it is. Right? We're trying to be alert to what creates health in ecosystems that we're a part of.
When Mac was talking, this question popped in my head. Mark, do you think in the United States we have a particularly challenging time with environmental issues because we are an individualistic society? If we were a more collectivist society, like, do collectivist societies in other parts of the world, are they doing a better job than we are?
Not necessarily. The Soviet Union was a collectivist society. They were horrible on the environment because of the way partly kind of they thought about what their purpose was and what the environment was for. So it isn't just individualism versus collectivism, it's the kind of way you understand yourself as an individual, as a part of a system. Because even individuals, we don't think we're off on our own all the time. We have to interact with others. And the kind of collectivism we pursue, collective action we pursue. Last note, everything I've said here, everything we've talked about as that would be the same even if climate change weren't a reality and the Trump administration weren't in power. Here are 2 significant things that we have to pay attention to right now. So next week, we'll explore how to think about stewardship in light of the realities of climate change and environmental degradation, and in the face of an administration that seems really uninterested in these things. So that's neither hopeful or nor hopeless. That's just, we'll come back next week and we'll see how we feel.
Thank you, Professor Douglas.
Yeah.
See you next week.